Thanks, Joe. Good morning. My name is Utsav. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a Section 230 defense campaigner with Fight for the Future. It's nice to have all of you here about 1 hour before the scheduled start of the hearing on Capitol Hill virtually with the big tech CEOs. But thank you all for joining our press conference today with an alternative perspective from disinformation experts, human rights organizations, here at Fight for the Future. To kick us off, I will first invite Director of the Fight for the Future, Evan Green.
Great, unmuting myself. Thanks so much, Utsaf, and thanks everyone for being here virtually. And I'm really excited about this event because there's been a number of these hearings on Capitol Hill where the lawmakers ask questions of the big tech CEOs, and the big tech CEOs basically say things like, my team will get back to you on that. And then nothing happens. And I think that's really frustrating for all of us here because I think there's a broad agreement that there are real harms that are coming from the business practices and underlying business models of some of these companies. But we're not really getting at the root cause of those problems. And often lawmakers are not really pushing towards solutions that will address those harms. Specifically today, we want to talk about the idea that changing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is sort of some silver bullet that will magically address all of the harms that we see from big tech companies and not do any harm in the process. And I think what we're going to hear from today is some alternative perspectives that are often left out of the mainstream narrative in this conversation, who are acknowledging these very real harms, proposing some alternative ideas for what to do about them, and explaining why blowing up, gutting, or radically or rapidly changing this foundational law for human rights and freedom of expression will actually do more harm than good, and in fact will benefit the largest companies, the ones that lawmakers say they are trying to rein in or address. And I thought it was very notable that in his testimony that he plans to say today at the hearing, Mark Zuckerberg expressed in the strongest terms yet his support for changing Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. And from my perspective, that's exactly because doing so will benefit Facebook while crushing competition from smaller, decentralized, and alternative platforms. And frankly, Facebook doesn't care that in the process, marginalized people will be harmed, human rights will be undermined, and global freedom of expression will be undermined. So we're here with a number of different experts who come from a wide range of perspectives and don't agree on all kinds of different things, but we're all here agreeing that blowing up, repealing, gutting Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act will not stop the harms of online disinformation. And you'll hear from different panelists about what they would suggest we do instead. So I'm going to kick it off first to Dr. Joan Donovan, who I think of as like a Boston punk legend, but is in fact a leading expert on disinformation and the harms of big tech. And she's going to kick us off this morning. So Joan, over to you.
Thank you. And coming from one punk to another, I think we end up here exactly the way we ended up in similar subcultural arrangements where the influence and impact of actual neo-Nazis are seriously disrupting and making it impossible for everybody else to use technology in the way that we want to. And one of the things that the research that we've been doing at the Shorenstein Center on online extremism, as well as on media manipulation and disinformation, is to showcase that it's a very small proportion of users that are not adhering to terms of service, but because of the way in which this technology is built, are able to have an outsized impact on our public conversations and culture. And so, you know, I'm not a lawyer by any means, and if I say the words freeze peach too loudly, if I actually say the FS word, maybe the hellhounds of Harvard Law School may descend on me. But there are a few things that we can do about hate, incitement, harassment that will help us understand more and better how do we design these platforms to put community safety at the center. And one of the ways in which, though, folks have had major impact over the last few years on our politics and on our advocacy, especially disinformers, is they use these systems differently than you or I. And so what's important here is that we understand that we want to protect press freedom. At the Shorenstein Center, fortifying journalism is one of our most important aims and missions, as well as defending society, which is to say that we want to have the maximum amount of freedoms online, but speech is a relationship. That is to say, when you are threatening someone, when you are using advertising tools to serve grandma scams and hoaxes, cures for coronavirus, for example, we want rules enforced about that. We want those things to be dealt with. And the reason why those scams, grifts, hoaxes, disinformation at scale matters is because of the way these current platforms are built. And if I contribute anything to the conversation today, it's to remember that the internet still exists. Platforms are built on top of it. Facebook is a product. Facebook is not the internet. I often think about platforms like you would think about a boombox. That is, speech is the cassette tape or the CD that goes in it. But what they really do is they amplify and they reach millions. And that has been an incredibly important asset to our advocates who essentially had a first mover advantage. Sasha Kostandichuk's work on design justice and transmedia actually helps us understand this even better, which is to say that in 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, when activists were using these platforms, in no small part because they were helping us move towards equality, they were functioning differently. The actual platforms were designed differently. They didn't preference advertising and power over everything else. And now we're in a position where Facebook 10 years later, Twitter 10 years later, YouTube 10 years later is a different technology. Advertising is a way in which we see media manipulators, disinformers get ahead of everyone else, get their, do a little bit of this search engine optimization and be able to get high up in the search returns. For a while, if you were to search for something like Black Lives Matter, you would get very intentionally white supremacist content because they were either paying for better placement or were essentially manipulating the algorithms. I've written about this with Brandy Collins for CJR, Columbia Journalism Review, about recently how 1619 and critical race theory as keywords are now effectively littered with racialized disinformation. Which is all to say that the problem is messy and the solution to it is going to come in many different forms. There's not going to be a 230 magic bullet. But I want to also add some hope, which is there is one thing we could do now that has nothing to do with 230 reform that might help us displace some of the lies and disinformation on platforms, which is to say, thinking back to, and this is research that April Glazier's done and stuff that she's published with Slate, but she's at NBC now, is we can actually pump up the volume on timely, local, relevant, and accurate content, just in the same way when you turn on that radio dial and at the top of the hour they say, this is WBCN and you were just listening to Pearl Jam, and tonight city council is going to be meeting about this, and there's a snow emergency. We can create within timelines and news feeds room for local journalism, room for the boring stuff, which is accurate content, room for things that are not trying to trigger emotional responses and go viral. And that would actually have the impact of displacing disinformation and lies if people had more access to the everyday information that is often not shared because it's not sexy, it's not interesting, but people do want it. It's just that they don't always get it in their feeds. And so, what those would look like would be asking for public interest obligations for social media. And that doesn't require us necessarily to go into 230 and do anything significant. So I'll close with that. Unfortunately, I have to hop off at 11:30. But I really appreciate all the work that Fight for the Future has been doing, and Wikimedia in this space and at this time, and especially the ACLU work on facial recognition technology. Really important that we all come together, universities, civil society, even the lawyers, and come at this with an orientation that understands that we do not want to destroy the benefits that the internet have brought to us, but at the same time, we want to put community safety at the center of design.
Thank you so much, Joan. Next, we have Jennifer Brody, who is the U.S. Advocacy Manager at AccessNow.
Great. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here. Really excited to join this conversation. So as was mentioned, I am the U.S. Advocacy Manager at AccessNow. We're a global human rights nonprofit that works to defend and extend the digital rights of users most at risk around the world. So when we talk about disinformation, as Joan mentioned, it's super complicated and there's a lot of other avenues in which we can address the problem. So the first one that I want to address is that the reason why disinformation is so effective is because of a phenomenon known as micro-targeting. And micro-targeting is only possible because platforms harvest so much deeply, deeply personal information about us. Everything from our psychological profile to our demographic info to our likes and dislikes. So if we're going to address the root of the disinformation crisis, a data protection law in the United States would go a really long way in helping to mitigate so many harms we face online. And also, as Dr. Donovan mentioned, we can't talk about disinformation without talking about systems of algorithmic amplification that recommend sensationalist, misleading content because it generates more eyeballs, which generates more profit. So we need algorithmic transparency to combat disinformation as well. Now I want to make a few quick points on Section 230. As we know, this law is very, very critical in helping to enable freedom of expression online. It has played an incredibly essential role for so many movements in the US, from the Me Too movement to Black Lives Matter, in which activists were able to leverage social media as an organizing tool to impact change. So in other words, Section 230 helps provide a platform for often silenced voices to speak out. And now, not only does the internet provide an important role for activists to organize in the United States, but globally as well. And online organizing is especially critical in authoritarian contexts where human rights groups and other activists have fewer outlets at their disposal to speak truth to power. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Arab Spring, in which social media platforms helped facilitate organizing in Tunisia and Egypt to topple dictators. So played a very essential role. And now, since the big tech companies, right, the men who will be testifying shortly, they are all US companies, and activists around the world use Facebook, they use Twitter, they use Google products, right? So gutting Section 230 would likely have a ripple effect across the world in chilling speech, right? We really can't forget that tech policy regulations in the United States leave a mark on the globe. What's more, many countries around the world look to the United States for cues on how to moderate content online. So we really can't mess this up. And finally, I just want to note, this being said, AccessNow is not opposed to extremely narrowly tailored, extremely thoughtful reforms to Section 230 that combat civil rights harms and other harms online. So if Congress is going to consider changing Section 230, lawmakers must hold hearings and, again, very carefully consider the long-lasting impact on marginalized groups first and foremost before making any changes. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen. Next, we'll have Kate Adamo, sex workers' rights advocate and a partner at Reframe Health and Justice.
Hi. And first and foremost, I want to say thank you for bringing this conversation together, and also for reminding everyone that we have to include the people who are impacted by this conversation. And like several folks have already said, to center not companies, but users in these conversations. And so I'm sharing my comments today as a community organizer and as an advocate for folks who trade sex, which is a community that's borne the brunt of what happens when reforms to 230 don't consider marginalized communities and instead create quickly drafted and generally budget neutral bills. The attempts thus far to reform Section 230 are not reducing harm, but they're pushing it out of sight. And so whether we're talking about the spread of disinformation or about the movement of interpersonal violence into digital spaces, those are not problems that were created by the internet, and they're not going to be solved by a purely digital answer. 230 isn't a singular problem, and the creation of additional liability, which is how many of these conversations have moved, is not going to be the silver bullet. When you create liability for intermediary platforms, what you do is you turn the most marginalized users into adversaries and liabilities. When FOSTA-SESTA was passed in 2018, sex workers became that liability to a company's bottom line, and even based on how the law was written, to the owner's freedom. And the result was really clear. Companies felt that as long as they showed the due diligence of purging sex workers and the sex trade from their platforms, they would remain safe. But we know exactly whose safety was compromised. And it's the safety of the same people every single time. It's people that trade sex, it's people that are marginalized, it's people who have the fewest options. And we know that a bill that everyone said was incredibly narrow and would not have widespread implications led to the closures of websites that began within minutes and led to dozens of sites that sex workers utilized to stay safe closing down. It led to housing instability, it led to economic precarity, it led to reductions in the ability to employ harm reduction techniques and a slew of other harms. And I will be frank that the community has yet to truly recover from what happened. Sex workers move to digital spaces for safety and for independence, but have become the easiest way to show a company's due diligence in removing unwanted content, and more importantly, for removing unwanted people from their platforms. So since FOSTA-SESTA, the community has been discussing the impacts of losing digital space, but unfortunately, so many of these conversations have continued to ignore those human impacts that 230 has, the changes to 230 has already had. And we're still lacking so much important and very basic information in this conversation. But in the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability, and even in the lack of a true and full understanding of how people are using digital space for safety, whether we're talking about remote overdose prevention or the distribution of basic safety information, we do have anecdotal information. We already know that automated moderation is impacting marginalized people in communities. We know that LGBTQ content is more likely to be flagged as offensive or as sexual. We know that the bodies of people of color are more likely to be flagged as sexual. We know that talking about harm reduction gets our accounts closed. We know that when companies like Facebook express their commitment to target certain criminalized activity, we know exactly who that means. We know exactly what's going to happen. We know that these attempts to moderate have replicated racism, whorephobia, misogyny, Islamophobia, and transphobia, and have pushed our communities out of the digital spaces that we sought out in the first place because of these issues. And so disinformation and propaganda are far from clear-cut, and unless we're incredibly careful, these are going to have the same impact of remarginalizing based on social capital and power. Who's going to flag the emails and speeches where Representative Wagner, who introduced FOSTA, says it's a success instead of a bill that created violence? What we need is not simply additional avenues for civil suits or additional reasons to remove users. What we need is transparency with how these platforms are making decisions. We need accountability and redress for those who are constantly kicked off for exercising basic survival. And we need a serious investment in anti-violence efforts. I take that last one the most seriously because I already know it's the one thing that's going to fall off the table the fastest. And it's not that we don't know how to prevent these forms of violence, it's that we don't know how to build the political will to fully fund them. And so the problem is not singularly based in 230. And until we begin looking at those roots, our best crafted solutions to digital harm are going to be atrophied before the ink has signed on the law. And so I ask us to look at more serious and more systemic ways that we can actually address and begin to fix some of these underlying problems.
Thank you, Kate. Next, we have Kate Ruan, for Senior Legislative Counsel at ACLU.
Thanks, Utsav, and thanks to everyone and Fight for the Future for setting this up. I first just wanted to echo a lot of the comments that have already been made, especially everything that Kate Adamo just said. Where I kind of want to start is, we've had a number of these hearings right now at this point, right, where the same three companies have been invited to testify: Facebook, Google, and Twitter. I think we do well, as Dr. Donovan pointed out earlier, to remember that Facebook, Google, and Twitter are not the internet. They may be the giants, and there's no question that they are tremendously powerful, but there are so many more participants in the internet ecosystem that are innovating, communicating, and providing services, including services that are directed to marginalized communities, and communities of color. It's concerning when we focus on Facebook, Google, and Twitter to the exclusion of those other internet businesses and communication platforms, because policies that are only thinking of the biggest platforms can wind up serving to perpetuate their dominance, I think. And I think the discussion of Section 230 is a prime example of that problem. Removing Section 230's shield creates legal risk for platforms that host user content. The only way to mitigate that risk in many circumstances will be to build automated systems, which we have already heard what the problems with those are, that scan and then censor speech on a massive scale. And in addition to everything we've already focused on, it is also something that only the largest platforms may be able to afford to do. The smaller platforms may not have that luxury, and that's why we see the shutdowns that we've been seeing. Furthermore, when it comes to disinformation specifically, amending Section 230 is unlikely to truly address the problem. One of the issues we'll face is that disinformation has no clear definition, and to the extent that it simply means, quote, speech that is false, it will often be protected by the Constitution, for better or worse. So it's not clear what we would actually be asking companies to remove. And even if they did remove it, they often probably couldn't be held liable for keeping it up. So it's unclear to me what Section 230 changes to address disinformation actually do to address the problems, other than encouraging companies to continue to deploy ever stricter censorship regimes, which we know disproportionately silence people of color, the LGBTQ community, Muslims, and other marginalized groups, and people that express dissenting views. But that doesn't mean we should throw up our hands when it comes to disinformation. There is a lot we can do, and we've heard a lot about it already. First, in my view, the companies and users, we could do more to promote truthful information in response to false and misleading information, especially where it causes a specific harm, like disinformation that deters or prevents people from voting. But more than that, as Jennifer mentioned earlier, meaningful privacy restrictions can also be tremendously helpful. If we limit the data these companies can collect and then empower users to limit the ways that the companies can use that data, it will be harder and harder for disinformation campaigns to target people in the first place. And I'd also like to agree with Jennifer again that we need algorithmic transparency to address disinformation as well. I think we should be talking about those things rather than about changing 230 to address disinformation, which also is not to say that no changes to Section 230 are ever appropriate if they address a specific harm and are tailored to provide a meaningful solution. And I want to keep everything brief, so that's all I have. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Kate. Next up, we'll have Lawrence Walters, goes by Larry, the General Counsel for the Woodhull Freedom Foundation and an attorney with the Walters Law Group. Larry, we can't hear you. You're on mute.
I guess somebody just unmuted me. Hello, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts. As mentioned, I'm the General Counsel for the Woodhull Freedom Foundation, which is a group that its mission is to affirm human sexuality as a fundamental human right throughout the world. And it's involved in a legal challenge to the first efforts to change Section 230, a law called FOSTA SESTA, which was passed in 2018. And so I can speak to these issues, from that standpoint, as far as what happened as a result of this first effort to modify Section 230. And the law turned out to be an unmitigated disaster. It was designed to try to attempt to help sex trafficking victims and combat sex trafficking online. But the end result was increased violence to sex workers, increased environment for violence for those who engage in consensual sex work, and the elimination of a tremendous amount of constitutionally protected speech from the internet. Shortly after the law was passed, many websites went dark. Others completely eliminated sections of their websites dealing in any way with personal services, Craigslist included. And it did nothing to address the actual intended effort of the law, which was to combat sex trafficking. And it's an important lesson to learn that censorship is never the answer. Amending Section 230 to require more content moderation is not going to combat disinformation online. Requiring more censorship is not going to prevent disinformation online. It's going to simply result in more efforts to, again, amend Section 230 and to bring on additional content moderation policies, which will end up in a vicious cycle of legislation and more legislation and more legislation. Section 230 implicates some really important First Amendment concerns. And first is freedom of speech, but also the freedom to not be forced to speak. And some of these proposals that we see are violating either one of those concerns, kind of the flip side of the coin. Either they're requiring more content moderation and holding platforms liable for speech posted by third parties, which is a violation of the First Amendment rights of the platform, or they're forcing the platforms to carry speech that they don't want to carry in the first place, which is a violation of the forced speech prohibition. So either way, there are fundamental First Amendment principles underlying Section 230 in the first instance. So we can attempt to try to modify Section 230. Congress can consider it, but I would say that there are significant First Amendment concerns and principles supporting and buttressing Section 230 in the first instance. And to the extent that any of these changes are made to Section 230 based on the content of the speech, in other words, select removal of immunity for certain types of speech, that's a violation of the First Amendment. And that issue is being currently considered by the district court in Washington, D.C. in the challenge to FOSTA SESTA. But at this point, we're going to see Congress consider potential changes to Section 230. We're going to see tech companies that want to be regulated. Why? So that they can say that they're simply following the rules when they remove speech. And this is not going to assist the users. I agree wholeheartedly with what was said about the importance of data privacy laws and enhanced privacy protection for users. That is a much more targeted approach, much more effective approach than eliminating Section 230 immunity or forcing platforms to carry certain types of speech. I would close by saying that Section 230, as it was passed in 1998, struck the correct balance between providing immunity for third-party speech and the right to moderate content on third-party platforms. And so we should really learn the lesson from the FOSTA SESTA efforts to change Section 230 and the disastrous results that occurred in the wake of that law, and consider that effort and that effect when Congress now considers additional changes that would do essentially the same thing in a different context. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry. And then last but definitely not the least, we have Sherwin C, the lead public policy manager at the Wikimedia Foundation.
Thanks very much, and thank you for bringing us all together. I'm very happy to be able to talk about this because it's one of the things that's actually quite important to the Wikimedia Foundation. So the Wikimedia Foundation is the nonprofit that hosts projects like Wikipedia. So we provide the servers, we work on the software and the interfaces for it, but Wikipedia is written by tens of thousands of users who volunteer their time, and they're the ones who change what's on the site several times each second. They're the ones who write and create what Wikipedia is. Now, Section 230 means that if one of those edits made several times a second defames somebody, causes some trouble, that Section 230 means that neither the foundation nor any of the other thousands of editors are blamed for that one person's action. It means that the communities on these projects can create and enforce their own standards for how content gets moderated. And for the most part, that content moderation deals with how encyclopedic something is, not whether it's illegal or abusive. So Section 230 isn't just about what is and isn't decent. It's about making sure that a website and the community that's on it can set standards around things like not accepting original research or self-promotion, or creating standards around biographical information. And sometimes these standards will respect article subjects' rights in ways that go beyond what's required in the law. So the fact that anyone can edit Wikipedia, that can open it up to inaccuracies, vandalism, even disinformation. But studies have been showing that it's generally a reliable place for generalist information. And that's because of the work of editors fixing these errors. But it's not just a back and forth between somebody vandalizing and somebody editing. It's when people disagree about facts, there's a process by which they engage in conversation about that. They have those discussions, they have sometimes very heated arguments about it, about the content, about making rules about that content. How do you source something? How do you cite something? How do you treat a biography of a living person? And having standards like that and letting communities build that in the context in which it operates, that helps make Wikipedia as accurate and reliable as it can be. And Section 230 is a necessary part of making that happen. So when it comes to disinformation, as people have been mentioning, disinformation is so hard to define. And that poor definition isn't just creating the possibility of getting things wrong in a law, it creates the possibility for abuse. Because what's taught in a textbook in one country would be considered disinformation by another country. You see disinformation laws being proposed by countries and governments where it's clearly a political pretext for suppressing criticism of the government. So trying to amend Section 230 to account for problems that are this complex when it comes down to the content level is not the way to go. So thank you.
Thanks, Sherwin. I'll pass it back to Evan if she has any closing remarks.
Sure. So thank you all so much for being part of this. And again, I really hope that if press are watching, or we're going to send out a release after this event, that some of these perspectives get included in some of the coverage of today's hearing, because readers are not getting the full story if they're only hearing from the CEOs of the largest tech companies and lawmakers. There's a lot more to this story, and I think the experts that you heard from today really underscore that. I did just want to add two small in terms of done. So, we've heard a number of different perspectives today, including urging lawmakers to finally pass a strong federal data privacy law. Joan Donovan had some excellent suggestions as well. And I did just want to mention that lawmakers also have an opportunity to do their due diligence on Section 230. Last session, Representative Rokana and Senator Elizabeth Warren introduced the Safe Sex Workers Study Act, a bill that would study the public health impact of SESTA FOSTA. It's likely that bill will be reintroduced. And so any lawmaker that says they would like to see Section 230 changed, from my perspective, it would be irresponsible to support further changes to Section 230 without first investigating whether the last change to Section 230 did more harm than good. And as we heard from Larry Walters, there's a significant and mounting amount of evidence to suggest that it did tremendously more harm than good. And so I think it's crucial that we not let lawmakers off the hook. This is not an issue that they can simply pass a law and wash their hands of. There are real harms that are being done to communities from these companies, and we want real policies to address those harms, not just using Section 230 as a political football to kick back and forth. So I'll wrap it up there. Lauren Feiner from CNBC, you were so kind to join us. And if you would like to ask any of our panelists a question, we'll open it up to you. And if anyone's watching on YouTube, but not in the Zoom, who would like to ask a question, feel free to drop it in the chat and we'll do our best to quickly answer. And then we'll wrap up so we can all get an extra cup of coffee or maybe even something stronger before we go into this hearing in the Energy and Commerce Committee.
Yeah, thank you, Evan, so much for hosting this and inviting me to ask a question. I guess one thing that is on my mind is if any of you have seen any proposals that you feel like, if not perfect, could provide a decent starting point to investigate, potential reforms to 230. And if you haven't seen a proposal like that yet, are there any kind of guiding principles that you're thinking about where you would say, okay, maybe this is a reform that could work?
Cool. So I'll let folks either just wave their hand or raise their hand in Zoom if they want to jump in. I'm happy to field this as well.
So I don't know about specific bills over others. The thing that I would say is one of the things that I would want to make sure of with any proposal is that it's clear about the specific harm that it's trying to address, and that it very clearly shows the connection between the harm it's trying to address and the changes that it proposes. I think that there's a lot of people really eager to do something to change things for the better, but the mechanisms by which that connects to a Section 230 proposal aren't necessarily as closely linked, or those links actually reach and have so many other unintended consequences. So I think making sure that there's that connection and that clear connection as to how this actually helps the underlying problem is something that I'm always looking to find.
Yeah, thanks, Sherwin. I would agree with that. And to answer your question more directly, Lauren, I would say I have yet to see a proposed change to Section 230 from lawmakers that I believe would do more good than harm. Our position at Fight for the Future is that we're open to it. We'll look at any proposal. We don't believe any piece of legislation is inherently sacrosanct. But again, I think from where I'm sitting, I also see this as largely a distraction in the sense that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit of policies that we could get in place that would begin to address these harms, such as addressing practices like data harvesting and micro-targeting, such as restoring net neutrality protections, Title II authority at the FCC to ensure that big tech companies like Facebook and Google can't cut deals with telecom companies like AT&T to solidify their monopoly power and crush competition from smaller and alternative platforms who might have better moderation practices or a better business model. So I think there's a lot that can be done. And so from my perspective, it's not a question of, what is the right way to change Section 230, but maybe we need to be asking ourselves, what else can we do to address these harms if this is not the way? And finally, I would say, I think a fundamental issue with using Section 230 as the lever to either incentivize good behavior or disincentivize bad behavior is that it is inherently a monopoly maker, right? The companies with the deepest pockets who can afford the most lawyers and deal with the most litigation are inherently going to be able to weather changes to Section 230 better than smaller platforms or as Sherwin explained, platforms with a more decentralized model, right? Even really seemingly well-intentioned changes to Section 230, like for example, the PACT Act, which would create sort of transparency reporting requirements for platforms. That sounds really reasonable on its face. Fight for the Future has called for more moderation transparency. Katie Adamo just spoke to that as well. We would love to see that. But when you use 230 to accomplish it and use liability as the mechanism to enforce it, again, that's a much easier policy for a company like Facebook to comply with than a company like Wikipedia or an organization like Wikipedia to comply with, or an organization or company like Reddit or Discord that are much more decentralized and rely on large numbers of volunteers. And we could see platforms of the future that provide an alternative to these centralized surveillance capitalist monopolies like Facebook and Google, but we're never going to see those come along if we attempt to use liability as the hammer rather than specifically taking arm at specifically harmful business practices that are at the root of harms that we're seeing, like disinformation. So that's my take. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? And Lauren, since you're our special guest, if you have another question, you're welcome to, and then maybe we can wrap up.
I think you pretty much answered it for me, so thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Well, Utsaf, I'll kick it back to you if you want to just say a quick closing. Joe, who is our wonderful tech at Fight for the Future, asked me to just invite anyone who's watching on YouTube to like and subscribe to the channel if you're interested in seeing more stuff like this in the future. And thanks so much to all of our panelists for being part of this. We'll get this video out to press and share it around so that folks can hear these important perspectives beyond, again, what happens in the hearing today. So thank you all so very much. Really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you so much on my end as well. Appreciate everyone's time and comments. You can expect much more from us later today when after the hearing wraps up, and we'll be sure to keep engaging with you on these issues. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.